What's good in the hood, YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you another video. Today I'm bringing you a video on Kamen Rider Build episode 24. This episode is called A Man Named Rogue, and this episode gives us a lot of information about how Rogue became Rogue, how he became a Kamen Rider, and also it does a number of other important things, so that's very cool. It also shows off a new hazard mode form, which is a form that we haven't even seen the standard mode that much in recent episodes, so it's cool to see it being used in a hazard mode. So that's cool, and that's, I think, the fourth hazard mode we've seen, so that's interesting. So let's get started with the actual episode itself. The episode begins with us seeing the continuation of the previous episode where Gentaku reveals that he is Kamen Rider Rogue, and what happens is that Sento asks him how did he become a Kamen Rider. So he says, I had to crawl my way back up. And what we end up seeing is a flashback where Gentaku approaches Nariki, his former assistant, asking him to make him a Kamen Rider, and he basically points down to Gentaku, basically says, and basically implies that you have to bow, and he doesn't do it at first, but he realizes that nothing's going to change unless he does it, so he does end up bowing to his former assistant, and it's definitely an interesting change of power and position here. So he ends up being locked up. Eventually Bloodstark does approach him and decides to make him the strongest Kamen Rider there is so far. And what we end up seeing is that he ends up being put up against several Guardians which manage to beat him down. He's shown to be very weak at first, and he is not in a position of strength. So all that does end up happening. Eventually what we do end up seeing is that he unleashes a power burst which leads to him having some strength to blast back some enemies. He then ends up transforming into Kamen Rider Rogue, and the flashback ends where we end up seeing Gentaku in the present day saying, I'm not gonna destroy you now, I'm gonna let you suffer and feel the pain that I felt. And at that point he ends up walking away. So then it continues with us seeing back in the Totoro Institute that Sento tells the Prime Minister, who is the father of Gentaku, that his son has turned into Kamen Rider Rogue and he has sided with Saito. Thing is that obviously the Prime Minister knows that more likely than not Gentaku has likely leaked information about Totoro wrong one, Totoro to Saito. So obviously he needs to be mindful of all of that. And what they decide to do is they actually decide to consider moving the Pandora's box. The only problem is that they actually are able to hear everything, Saito, because there's actually a sensor or a speaker that's in there that's allowing them to hear any conversations that occur. So they know what their plan is, and so the Saito Prime Minister basically says to Gentaku to get to the Pandora's box before they move it, which makes a lot of sense. So what does end up happening from here is that we end up seeing that Sento goes to pay his respects to Aoba and Kiba, where Aoba ended up dying initially. So that does end up happening. Bloodstark does approach Sento and says, I want my bottles back that I gave you. And they were the bottles that he gave him back when he fought in the representative battle. So what happens is that Sento's like, why do you think I would give you those bottles? And he says, and at that point he ends up transforming into Rabbit Tank Sparkling. So he ends up fighting against Bloodstark, which doesn't go very well when he's in that form. So he actually loses half, I believe, of the bottles. I believe he loses half of the bottles. And following this, what ends up happening is that he ends up transforming into the Kaizukresha hazard mode, which is a mode we haven't seen that much in recent episodes, but it was a bigger deal when it was first introduced. So we end up seeing that mode. He ends up trying to fight against Bloodstark, which he actually gets to a hazard level of 4.4, which is really strong. I think it's even stronger than Grease's strength was, because Grease was at 4.2, I believe, so that's pretty interesting. So what we do end up seeing eventually, actually no, Ryoga was at 4.2. I I think so. Yeah. So what we do end up seeing eventually is that what do you call it? He manages to blast Bloodstark through a wall. He actually unleashes his hazard trigger past its limits and leads to that burst of energy that goes to 4.4. And when he's about to really beat on Bloodstark, what happens is that Grease comes out and he does a kick, which leads to Sento detransforming and saving Sento's life. And at that point, what happens is that Bloodstark basically says, "I'll let you keep those bottles for now. Gentaku will get them for me." So at that point he retreats, and what we end up seeing is that Sento thanks Grease for rescuing him and preventing him from going insane. And what happens is that he says, "It's nothing. I thank you for paying your respects to the two Hokuto members." And so that's important, obviously. Now, what also is interesting is they, and this is something that I forgot to mention, is that Bloodstark mentions the idea of how Rogue or Gentaku basically has lost everything and can do anything now, as opposed to Sento, where he has so much to lose and he has no resolve. And resolve is really important in this episode because of the fact that he has everything to lose, as opposed to Gendaku, which has lost everything already. He is in a weakened state. He can reach his limits. He's reached them. There's nothing holding him back anymore. Basically, that's how you put it. So what we do end up seeing is that from here, Grease does ask if he could join up and team up together to defend Totoro and Hokuto and side together. And what happens is that Sento agrees to it. So then Grease finally says that you can call me Kazumi, and basically the remaining Hokuto member and himself join them and they will side together. So that is cool to see. There is some skirmishes that occur between Ryoga and Kazumi, but overall good situation, and great to finally know that is official, that they are now teaming up. So that's cool. What we do end up seeing eventually is that Sento goes down to the lower cellar in the cafe and he's upset. Mizora tries to cheer him up, and there's a conversation that's brought up regarding being happier and all that, and how he needs to remember to fight for peace and justice and all that. And Mizora says something like this, and following that, her bracelet reacts, and what happens is that suddenly she begins to faint, and eventually she just does faint. So then at that point, Sento tries to wake her up, and Ryoga comes into the room and tries to wake her up as well. But then what happens is that shortly after this, they get a distress call from the Prime Minister saying that Saito has now been attacking in Totoro and that they need to go and deal with it. So at that point, what we end up seeing is that the Washio Bros are there with Gentaku and also some Guardians. The Guardians are destroying several soldiers from not Sento, Totoro. Thank you, Thor. So what does end up happening from here is that we end up seeing that Kazumi, Ryoga, and Sento, as well as the remaining Hokuto member, end up appearing on the scene. We do end up seeing that Gentaku actually goes into the Totoro Institute, where he confronts his father, asking about the Pandora's box so he can get it. And also he ends up holding a gun to his father, which is pretty interesting to see. So all that does end up happening. Eventually from here, the Prime Minister does unveil the Pandora's box, which eventually Sento does go into the building, tries to stop Gentaku from stealing the Pandora's box, but what does end up happening is that he manages to steal it and he flies away. So at that point, Sento has to switch to Hawk Gatling mode, and he ends up going after Gentaku. In the meantime, what happens is that Grease ends up seeing everything that's occurring, and he ends up using the copter bottle to fly away with his partner from Hokuto, and Ryoga tries to grab onto him, but he misses, so he has to go run to where they're heading to. We also see that Mizora does end up waking up, and there's this there's a very quick walking sequences that occur, which lead to her exiting the building. So all that does end up happening. In the meantime, following this, all of them appear at the sky wall, right outside of it, where Gentaku now has the Pandora's box, and we end up seeing several fights occur. There's fighting between Sento and Rogue or Gentaku, and in the meantime, we end up seeing Ryoga and Kazumi fighting against the Washio Bros, which is pretty interesting to see them all fight together. And then finally, what happens is that Sento ends up using like the Rabbit Tank sparkling mode, and then he also uses the Rabbit Tank hazard mode. And in both cases, it seems like Gentaku is stronger than the hazard mode. So that's really important, because clearly in his current state, the hazard mode, even though it strengthens Sento, it doesn't strengthen him enough to the point that he can actually go up against Gentaku, which is pretty interesting. But there is going to be another form later on that will fix that problem, where he will be able to control that form and actually utilize its true strengths. We'll get into that eventually. I'm not expecting that like now, but I would say probably in the next few weeks I would see that happening, and that will be the Rabbit and Tank forms. Those will be when he'll be able to actually access the hazard mode and use it to its full strength without going insane or losing himself like he has. So that's really important. Following this, Mizora does eventually appear on the scene, and she ends up looking out at everyone, and they all are curious as to what's going to happen. Her eyes have a different look to them. They are not the normal color that she has, and everyone is very curious as to what she's going to do. In the preview, we actually see that she has some interesting new abilities that she has. She seems like she's probably going to be possessed in some way, but she will be voiced by another person in the next episode. She most likely isn't going to become a Kamen Rider, but she will be a character that will likely be the human embodiment of the Pandora's box itself, which is interesting. So we'll have to see how that actually works, but that is what people are suspecting, that she will likely end up being the human form of the Pandora's box in the next episode. So that is pretty cool to see, and we'll have to learn more about that in the future. But yeah, so that's about it for me. I'd love to know your guys' opinions. Did you guys enjoy this episode? I personally did a lot. I can't wait to see what next episode will bring, especially with Mizora now having more of a function than she has, which she's had a big function, but this will be very interesting to see where it will expand with her now. So please remember to like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to know your opinions of this episode. Tell me what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye, guys.